So today I want to talk a little bit about a text that has been really helpful to me in researching and writing many of the topics that I cover on this channel and on Substack and wherever else it is that I'm sharing my work on everything from Marxism to Lucretius to obscure new religious movements, Heaven's Gate, of course. And this is a book called The Craft of Research. This is basically a handbook for students, scholars, and writers of nonfiction. So I'll talk a little bit about what this book consists of, where you can find it, and what I like most about it, why I think it's really helpful if you're any kind of writer of any kind of nonfiction, particularly nonfiction that involves a lot of research. So let's jump into it.
The Craft of Research is a handbook for students, scholars, and writers of nonfiction. It was first compiled in 1995 by three professors from the University of Chicago, Wayne C. Booth, Gregory G. Colomb, and Joseph M. Williams, all of whom were well-respected experts in English, literature, and/or academic writing. The Craft of Research focuses primarily on three things: defining what exactly research is, providing guidelines for planning and conducting research, and offering suggestions for converting your research into polished writing. Now, while more comprehensive standalone versions of this book are still available, many students today will probably encounter a condensed version of The Craft of Research within another reference text for academic writers, Kate L. Turabian's A Manual for Writers of Research Papers, Theses, and Dissertations, sometimes simply called Turabian for short, and not infrequently mistaken for the Chicago Manual of Style. The two are related, as I will explain, but they are not the same book. Like Booth, Colomb, and Williams, Kate Turabian was also affiliated with the University of Chicago, although she was not a professor there. Instead, Turabian worked in the school's administration before she was appointed as the first dissertation secretary in 1930. Now, we may presume that not all of the papers Turabian came across in that time were exactly up to par, because in 1937, she produced a pamphlet which would basically contain the bare bones of what would later become the Manual for Writers, and distributed this pamphlet to students and faculty members on the University of Chicago's campus. Then, in 1955, this pamphlet was expanded into a full-length book, the first edition of A Manual for Writers. Turabian died in 1987, having lived to see her handbook's fifth edition published just a few months prior. As of 2025, A Manual for Writers is currently on its ninth edition. So earlier I said that the Turabian Manual sometimes gets confused with the Chicago Manual of Style. Well, that's because the Manual for Writers that Turabian eventually published in 1955 and is still in publication today, as well as the original pamphlet that was based off of, that she put out in the 30s, was itself kind of a condensed version of the Chicago Manual of Style, which itself was first introduced in 1906 and many decades later ended up becoming one of the big three formatting citation styles, the other two being MLA from the Modern Language Association and APA from the American Psychiatric Association. Today, I think Chicago style is preferred, especially by historians and maybe also literary criticism, that sort of thing. But originally, the Chicago style was really just an in-house convention that the University of Chicago writers and professors were using. In any case, the original pamphlet that Turabian put out was really a condensed version of that Manual of Style, and even the expanded version, the Manual for Writers, or the Turabian, was really just really focused a lot on formatting and citation requirements. That is what it was primarily concerned with for most of that book's publication history. To an extent, that is still true today, insofar as stylistic guidelines still form the bulk of the Turabian Manual, but starting in 2007, portions of another book, also an in-house original from people working at the University of Chicago, started to be included at the forefront of the Turabian Manual. And that, of course, was Booth, Colomb, and Williams's The Craft of Research. So nowadays, if you get an edition of like a recent edition of the Turabian, you will see that in the first part of the book, like it's usually just called Part 1, and it has some subtitle or another, is really excerpts from this book, The Craft of Research. So that's the connection between these three different books. You have The Craft of Research, which is now included in the Turabian Manual, which was itself originally a condensed version of the Chicago Manual of Style. All three of these books are three completely separate things, related but separate from one another. But it gets confusing because some of them are like inside of one another and some of them are condensed versions of the other one. So it's like this whole thing. But in any case, the main thing I wanted to focus on was The Craft of Research, and kind of what I find useful about it. So the interesting thing about this is that each of these authors specialized in certain things. So Wayne C. Booth specialized kind of in the theory of research, of like defining what research actually entails. And that's actually how The Craft of Research begins, is with the authors kind of acknowledging that, like, this is kind of an odd thing to think about, but when you have like a clear understanding of what research entails beyond just like this very basic idea of like, oh, I'm looking for information, and it's like, well, it's got to be a little bit firmer than that. I think that's one of the things I like about their approach is they focus a lot on making sure that you are clear in what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then that allows you to get clearer on how you plan to do it. Because if you know what you're doing, you know why you're doing it, you can start to get into questions about how can I do this the most effectively? How can I do this the most efficiently? How can I do this in a way that helps me as a writer, helps my readers? And here's one thing that, I talk a lot about in my writing series. How does it help the people that I go for help from? How does it help the people that I solicit feedback from? So I think there's a lot of information, a lot of suggestions that these authors give in this book that are helpful for all three of those things. Colomb was the guy that came up with the research questions. So this is actually my favorite part of The Craft of Research, is the research questions. They talk about how to come up with a research question, which is basically you're asking, what do I want to know? Why do I want to know it? And what do I think I will get by knowing it? Williams, by contrast, was really the one that was probably responsible for most of the stylistic conventions, because that's what he wrote a lot about. He wrote a couple of books just about writing style. So all three of these guys worked together to compile this handbook for people that write nonfiction, for people that have to do research. Not scientific research, not like laboratory research, but reading research. So they talk a lot about looking for sources and all that stuff. But my favorite thing about it is the research questions. I use that a lot in my work on Heaven's Gate, on philosophy, on history, on anything. A lot of the things that I cover on this channel and that I cover in my writing, I use this three-part research question concept that I take from The Craft of Research. I think it's helpful for you as a writer to have a clear research question that you can format that way, because it keeps you focused. It's also good for your reader, because if you're focused as a writer, your reader will find it easier to focus as they read your written work. And another thing that doesn't maybe get talked about as often, but I think is just as important, if you can fill in those blanks of those three questions under the research question idea, you can give that to somebody that you're asking for help from. Like if you're working on something or you're just starting out on a project, and you can get to a point where you can answer all three of those questions, and you tell somebody else and you ask them, where should I go from here? Where should I look for information about such and such? It's a lot easier for people to give you feedback on your work and to give you guidance and suggestions on your work if they know what exactly it is you're trying to do. If you can't explain what you're trying to do to other people, it makes it harder. It just makes it harder for people to help you. So it helps you in all three of those like essential domains. You as a writer, helps your reader, and it helps the people that you're getting feedback from. Who would I recommend this book to? Obviously, students, people that write for the academy, or people that write academically. So even if you're not working for the academy, but you're writing and conducting rigorous research about a complicated but important topic, whatever that happens to be. And I would also even recommend it to like content creators. I mean, like I said, like I use this in the YouTube videos. I mean, granted, like, the kind of videos I make are more, educational. That's not what all of YouTube is, but you'd be surprised if you start looking at like statistics and surveys that they've done on this question. A lot of people increasingly are coming to YouTube for educational content. So there is an audience out there. And so, if you are a content creator, like really is irrelevant. If you're doing true crime, if you're doing true crime content, even taking this research question concept and applying that to your work, I mean, I would suggest it to any kind of content creator, just because you want to make sure that you're giving your audience something that is valuable, something that contributes to knowledge of whatever topic it is, whether it's a game review video, a true crime murder fest video, or a video about philosophy or Heaven's Gate, whatever your thing is. So that's kind of what I've got for The Craft of Research. It's one of my favorite reference texts. It's a really helpful resource to me. And if you've never heard of it and you've never seen it before, maybe check it out and see if it could be helpful to you in whatever your particular area of interest happens to be. Till next time, thanks.